right. Good day. Greetings and thank you everyone for joining us today for the Center for Studies, the UC Berkeley Center for Studies in Higher Education webinar. We're learning today how universities worldwide implement diversity, equity, and inclusion along with and adopting that with the aim of preparing their students for work, for life, and for citizenship. We should learn also how alignment of DEI with global learning can definitely contribute, enrich this preparation for students. With questions being raised in several United States regarding the value of DEI, this presentation today is extremely valuable. Our speakers today have gained great knowledge of the subject through long and high-level experience, and they will be sharing their research, their knowledge, and their experience. First, we will hear from Dr. Dawn Michelle Whitehead. She is the Vice President of the Office of Global Citizenship for Campus, Community, and Careers at the Association of American Colleges and Universities, AAC&U. Earlier, she served as Director of Curriculum Internationalization in the Global and International Studies program at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. She also has been Faculty Director for Global Service Learning in several countries, Costa Rica, Ghana, Kenya, and the Kingdom of Swaziland. Now, our other speaker is Dr. Roger Brindley. He is Vice President for Global Programs at Penn State, where he is in charge of those who are managing education abroad programs, the support of international students and scholars, and facilitating international partnerships for the university. Before this post, he was Vice President of USF, the University of South Florida, where he oversaw over 5,000 students from 147 countries and over 2,000 students studying abroad and 1,200 faculty teaching and doing research overseas. So we have very well qualified speakers. Now, returning to webinar structure, many of you participants raised questions for these speakers as you registered for the webinar. And all of you may raise questions in the chat function on your screens throughout the presentation. We welcome your questions, and the speakers will be addressing them after they complete their presentations. Now, I turn to our first speaker, Dawn.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and we are very excited to speak with you today and to be a part of this webinar. Without further ado, we want to just give you an overview of the format in terms of what the content is that Roger and I want to share. First, we think it's really important that we share our framing of diversity, equity, and inclusion so you understand where we're coming from throughout this webinar.
Great. Great.
Okay, wonderful. And secondly, we want to talk a bit about diversity, equity, inclusion in global learning as we look at the curriculum, and then talk about some research that's been done on student perceptions of DEI and global learning, and then finally talk about international students and DEI and global challenges and opportunities. Then we look forward to getting to the Q&A. So without further ado, I will kick off with the framing that our association brings to diversity, equity, inclusion, so that you have a better sense of what it is that we're talking about when we say these three terms. And from AAC&U's perspective, when we talk about DEI, we mean integrative DEI. So diversity, equity, and inclusion are integrated. We don't see them as individual practices. We look at what happens when you blend the three practices together. And so first, when we talk about diversity, we are referring to individual differences as well as group or social differences. And so the individual, of course, that could be learning style, life experience, personality, many other factors. And then we look at the group differences, which could be class, ethnicity, race, gender, faith tradition or no faith tradition, sexual orientation, etc., political affiliation. And so that's what we're talking about when we think about DEI from the diversity standpoint. The other piece that's
Dawn, excuse me, but we're not moving on with the slides. We're stuck on the title slide.
Okay, let's try again. I will reshare and get, hopefully this time you will see inclusion. Okay, right now, do you see the slide that says?
Yes, I do. Do you want to? There you go.
Now you perfect. All right, thank you so much. And so again, the diversity piece, fortunately, that's one that most people are familiar with when we talk about diversity, the individual and the group differences. And then we think it's important to consider inclusion. And so that's the active, intentional, ongoing engagement with diversity in ways that increase awareness, knowledge, cognitive sophistication, and empathic understanding. And we aren't the only ones who share this particular frame for diversity and inclusion. There are other organizations that have shared this framework. And some of you may be familiar with our model of inclusive excellence. And this is when you are looking at diversity and inclusion to provide the process to get to equity and the process to get to excellence. And this is a framework that many colleges and universities have been using for many years. But it's not just colleges and universities that use this frame. And we also have seen this framework in other places, including the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. And they have a framing on diversity and inclusion. One, they argue, is that diversity is essential for excellence. The more difficult the problem, the greater the benefit of diversity in finding the solution. They think it's important to look at the dimensions of diversity and close those gaps. And then finally, inclusion is necessary and essential to reap the benefits. And we have to go beyond counting to look at full participation and who's actually involved in doing the work. Finally, that brings us to, of course, equity, which is the creation of opportunities for those who have historically been underrepresented, marginalized, or not included in these opportunities. And it's not just about access, it's about participation and identifying these gaps that interfere with participation. And with that, I want to turn it over to Roger to share his framing of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thanks, Dawn. And it's this notion of participation that I think gets to global DE&I. There's some key ideas here on the slide. But for domestic students, cultural responsiveness can be as simple as understanding that students from Vietnam and Laos are not Chinese. It can be as simple as faculty and staff of universities understanding that only 42% of American citizens own a passport. So what is the implication for us when the majority of our students will not study abroad? How do we help them build multiple perspectives, a worldview, empathy for others? These are critical questions for us. And then for international students, how do we seek to have immersive and integrated experiences in curricular and co-curricular life at our universities so that they are part of an intentional broad community of learners? And I wrote in the bottom there, DE&I is in the global systems all around us. It's not just a US issue. One of the things that worries me, Dawn, every day that I do this work, particularly as we are in an era of free speech and First Amendment discussion in higher education at this time, is what does it mean for an international student to come to the United States, spend 4 years watching this rather ungainly and ugly democracy of ours grow and mature, and then leave? Will they leave with lessons learned? Will they understand what diversity and equity means in the United States and then take that back to their home context? Let's go to the next slide, Dawn. So let's just consider, if we will, education abroad. I'll come back to international students later in our presentation. But here's the reality. Almost 70% of the students in education abroad in the United States higher education sector today are Caucasian, they're female, and they're from relatively affluent backgrounds. So when we talk about DE&I on our campus, we can't have it both ways. We can't talk out of one side of our face and then not out of the other. So we have to realize that in order to talk the talk, we have to create structures that encourage us to walk the walk. And in the context of education abroad, let's consider the countries that we visit, Dawn. Well, there they are. The top 7 are in Europe. They're almost half of all the education abroad experiences that higher education students have in the United States every year. And this is our challenge, isn't it? So when we talk about education abroad, how do we talk about multiple price points? How do we talk about the ways that we need to bring in multiple locations? Yes, our students want to study Spanish in Madrid, but actually for less than half the cost, they can study Spanish in Colombia. How do we work to think about multiple entry points for students, multiple price points? And then, of course, we have to structure in academic scholarships that allow some of our low SES students, some of our historically marginalized students to consider education abroad within a context that the vast majority of them don't even think about it because they just don't think it's possible. Thanks, Dawn. So I've summarized that in this slide here. I think it's really important we think about location. We think about our low SES students. We think about the white kids who go to Europe. What does access and affordability mean within the context of outbound mobility? And that's my first commentary that I want to layer on top of Dawn's work to date. Back to you, Dawn.
Thank you for that. And I think the next thing we want to talk about are the value and benefits of global learning with the DEI lens. And to do that, we must think about global learning beyond education abroad. Now, in full disclosure, I am the vice chair of the board of directors of the Forum on Education Abroad. So I am an advocate for education abroad. As Margaret said earlier, I led short-term education abroad programs, but there are many, many practices that we can use to help students have opportunities to experience global learning. There are many examples. For example, what we're seeing a lot right now, and many of your institutions might be doing this, collaborative online international learning or virtual exchange. Many people use different phrases where students have those experiences to engage across the world in their classrooms. Community engaged learning, and that can happen locally or internationally, and it can still be a global experience. Students participating in undergraduate research experiences in global contexts. Again, that could involve travel where they're actually going to a country and engaging in these experiences, or the content and the focus could be globally focused. There are so many examples and opportunities for intercultural engagement where students are able to put the skills and learnings of global learning in practice. We can go from internships to world languages to capstone experiences. There are many opportunities for our students to have these experiences. But the real question is why? And what are the benefits of these experiences? What do we mean when we talk about global learning that aligns with DEI and comes from a lens of DEI? One is we're thinking beyond the practice to the process. So we're moving from the idea that, okay, we just want to get students abroad. That's great. But what is the process? What's the approach? Why are we doing it? What is the benefit? What are they going to do? We have to look at connections between both curricular and co-curricular experiences. So students have opportunities to engage with the world in their formal academic experiences and also outside. But one of the key hallmarks when you look at global learning, and Roger can talk about this at Penn State, and you'll see it in many other places, it often involves addressing complex problems. Students may not figure out the problem, but they have opportunities to engage in global challenges. where they're bringing the perspectives from their disciplines, from their departments, as well as from their lived experience and the lived experiences of those around them. And again, another key dimension of global learning that aligns well with DEI is students are drawing on diverse perspectives. They're no longer just learning from scholars from their corner of the world or working in labs in their communities. They're engaging and working with people and perspectives that span the globe. And they're able to use this knowledge to enhance their own experiences in their local community and to address problems that are global. Finally, it's also a bit about social and personal responsibility, what students' commitments are to their communities and what they are to the broader world. And so when we come at this, and Roger already touched on this, so I won't take a long time with this, is when we come at this perspective, we're thinking about who participates in our global learning experiences and who doesn't. How do different groups participate? What might we do to work toward full participation? How are we recruiting and retaining students for these programs? And are we disaggregating this data by race and ethnicity? And I would go a step further, and I think Roger's going to touch on this later. When we're looking at our international students, we are looking at which students from which places participate. We have to go beyond just saying the international students, because we know there's a tremendous amount of diversity among our international students. And then finally, when we think about the benefits of diversity, equity, inclusion, and global learning, both provide us with knowledge and expertise in students to address human diversity and perspective consciousness. It helps them develop intercultural skills. It helps point us toward institutional transformation, where we're actually meeting the needs of our local communities and we're meeting the needs of tomorrow. We're going back to the purpose of higher education to improve life for people, to improve society. It helps us understand social justice in a global context. And it moves us from thinking our justice issues are local issues when they're really global issues. Again, it helps us examine power and privilege, both locally and internationally. And many would argue, and you'll hear the voices of students saying, it's impossible to engage one without the other. Finally, when we think about this value piece, is employers and what employers want. And at AAC&U, every few years we do an employer survey where we ask employers specifically, what are the skills that you value for graduates when you're hiring? What are you looking for? And you can see 2020, the top one was the ability to work in teams. And again, that often means cross-cultural teams. So students have to learn how to work across differences, different communities, different disciplinary perspectives, different backgrounds, different countries of origin, critical thinking, the ability to analyze and interpret data, application of knowledge in real-world settings, and digital literacy. So these are all skills that, by providing students with global learning experiences with a DEI lens and engagement, that students should be able to get. Now, what I want to talk about next, or sorry, I'll just say this very quickly, and Roger will touch on this quite a bit later, is again, when we're thinking again about the international students, Chris Glass has some great research in this area. And he again pushes us to look at this when we're talking about international students, to look through an intersectional lens. So we're seeing all of the dimensions of our international students and their heterogeneity. What part of the world they're from? What are they studying? What is their faith tradition? What role does their gender play? How are they engaging with the institution, and what are the differentiated experiences they may have? And how do we then build on that to make sure that the students feel as if they belong at the institution? So I just want to quickly share a few examples from a research project that Hilary Landor from Florida International and I have been working on. And so we were wanting to know how students conceive of global learning and diversity, equity, and inclusion, what connections they make between the two practices, what types of integration do they see or expect, and then what suggestions do they have? And I just want to share a few examples from this. And what we did is for our data collection, we had 1 hour focus group interviews through Zoom for the students. And they were from 6 institutions of higher education within the US. And the students were, in some cases, more diverse than the population of higher education in the United States. And I'll share a little bit of that. And then we also had a follow-up focus group where students were able to come across institutions. So this is in a handout that we'll share with you, but you can just see the breakdown in the types of institutions that we engaged. A Western rural institution, diverse urban institution, Western urban, Midwestern, and you can see Two of the institutions were quite large. We may say three, the one with 31,000. And then we also had two smaller institutions. And you can see the breakdown for student population. This is for the institution as a whole, not the students we interviewed. And what the students told us, one is that global learning is related to learning. So they thought about education abroad. They thought about the curriculum, and they also thought about international students. When it came to DEI, they told us it was about campus climate. It was about a sense of belonging. It was about identity development, corrective action, and decolonization. These are the words that the students used. So one example I'll share from a student from Western University is he said, DEI seems very focused on the struggle going on within the United States. And from the DEI perspective, there's little to no global perspective at all. But the more he talked, he brought up the murder of George Floyd. And then he said he discovered on his own, not someone from the institution, that there were people in France who were protesting. And he said, well, why aren't we connected with them? So it helped him see this broader connection between what he thought was a local DEI issue that was indeed a global issue. Another student from HSI, Urban University, was an engineering student. And she said it was difficult to make connections when we asked about making connections. And then she talked about a research project that she had done that intertwined traditional Chinese medicine and electrical engineering. So that was a course-based experience where she was able to make those connections. And then last, I'll give this the example from Daniela, the name that we gave this student. And she worked in the climate justice community, the climate justice movement. And she was able to make connections to the impact of climate change on people in vulnerable communities who tend to be from vulnerable groups. And she argued that, again, this was a clear connection between DEI and global learning that no one made for her, but in her community engaged learning work, she saw these connections. And so with that, I'll just affirm the students thought DEI, they thought DEI was about climate, global learning was educational. The students know when there's integration and when there's not integration. They see DEI as connected with global learning, and they had ideas for what we should be doing as institutions. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Roger.
Excuse me. Lovely to see your slides there, Dawn. I think probably our participants are working out we have two different learning styles now, because wonderful slides from you. But I want to bring us back then to what DE&I looks like globally on our campus. And I want to challenge us in light of Dawn's slides and her research and observations. So let's look at the international students here. And again, diving right back into IIE data, we see that over half the international students in the United States come from two countries. There's much concern in the United States today about our geopolitical relationship with China and declining Chinese numbers. But we know not just from India, but from South Asia in general, increasing numbers of students from that part of Asia. South Korea, Canada, and Vietnam there. But 51% from two countries. I, like many of you, come from institutions that proudly inform the world, as well we should, that we have international students from over 150 countries. But how many students do we have more than 50 students from? How many countries do we have more than 50 students from? So when we think about this, we inevitably come back to the financial proposition of international students. And I implore everybody here, when we think about global DE&I and international student recruitment, enrollment, retention, graduation, OPT, alumni, please think about diversity of students. We were talking a few minutes ago about the intersectionality of international students. Here's some realities. The reality is that the average GDP in the world today, according to the World Bank, is $12,235 per person. According to IECF in the United States today, the average cost of attendance at a US university for international student ranges from about $30,000 to $90,000 a year. The reality is we are bringing in the children of government, business, industry, and educational elite, and increasingly military elite. And I wonder how that sits with our discussions about DE&I on our campus. And I wonder whether our SIOs are talking to our CFOs about this. And I wonder whether we're talking about scholarship programs that effectively allow for lower financial access points to our institution, so that international students aren't just seen as widgets that save our budget. If we're going to talk about global DE&I and international students in the United States, we have to do this work. And we have to appreciate that with over a million international students in the United States today, our diversity is still an issue of major concern. Come back to that thought in a few minutes. If we go on to the next slide, Dawn. So we build these systems around our university. We do DE&I and educational equity, or in the senior diversities officer, and heaven forbid they work with the global or international education office. Actually, we know from the research there are many examples when we do, but we're still learning to do this work. Similarly, we're still learning to do the work with our vice presidents for research. The flip side of international students and that diversity is if you take away the graduate international students in our colleges of engineering, most of our engineering colleges are in deep, deep trouble. So we have to think seriously about the way we structure our systems, because global DE&I and international student mobility is extremely complex. The intersectionality is real. We have this myth in the United States that all the international students coming here are wealthy. Well, as many of your immigration officers can tell you, those coming from key parts of the world have pooled together their entire extended family savings to send them to the United States. And perhaps it's not surprising, therefore, that optional practice training is becoming more and more critical for so many international students who find the finances to study at our university. So we have diversity around background. We need diversity by location. What does it mean that less than 5% of our students come from Africa? If we are serious as institutions of higher education in the United States in being global leaders in nation building, what does it mean that less than 5% come from Africa? Is it simply that they cost over 2.5 times more per capita to recruit? Is that the issue? Perhaps it's scholarships. Perhaps it's different points of access. But we need to look at these contextual matters, and we need to have these conversations in our universities with our enrollment management teams, even if international student admissions and recruitment does not report into the office of the senior international officer. Let's become involved in this global DE&I discussion. Certainly, we need to be finding campus life opportunities for international student associations to be working hand in glove and together with, interwoven with, our students who are part of our domestic student associations, our domestic student government organizations. We absolutely have to do that. And I challenge groups like our Students of India Association by saying to them, we will know when you have crossed that bridge, when you have US domestic students coming to the Students of India Association meetings, and not just first-gen diaspora of India either. Dawn, let's go on to my next slide. So how do we challenge some of this? Well, on our campus, I want to suggest that we need to be thinking very hard about the readiness of our campus life, the quality of our housing. Is it possible for us to have housing and to have meal plans and residential life experiences that take into account our international students? We sometimes do that pretty well on campus, actually, but then we have students who want to go home during the summer, but their landlords off campus make them pay for a 12-month lease. There's work we have to do to readiness our communities in order to bring in international students. And then we need to have their student success. Fortunately, the data shows that retention and graduation rates amongst international students is at or above our typical student profile norms. And we want to keep it that. One of the challenges that I have related to student success in our international students, and I struggle with this, is what's our obligation when an international student has paid 3 years towards their 4-year undergraduate degree? An institution such as mine, that can easily get them to $150,000. And then their parent loses their job at the beginning of their senior year. What then? What's our obligation as a So it's that integration into thinking, the planning, the strategies, and the tactics of campus, across the ecosystem. That ecosystem certainly includes the senior diversity officer and educational equity, but includes your council. It includes your student affairs professionals, your faculty senate and your faculty groups, your staff advisors, those amazing staff and counseling supporters of students, your institutional research areas, because they're the ones who build in the budgets in their grants to be able to keep an international graduate assistant. All of those areas and many, many more. And I want to think about cost of attendance in my closing thoughts. I wonder what it means to lower access points financially, to create multiple entryways into US higher education. Yes, the cornerstone of international student mobility is the in-residence experience, the campus life experience. But what would it mean for us to have more thoughtful and intentional dual degrees and 2+2s and 3+1s and 1+3s with our partners overseas, particularly in continents like Africa, where if I could do the first 2 years at home, that would be a huge lift for me as a prospective student. I think we need to think seriously about digital and online programs. You know, I reflect daily that there are 600 million people under 25 years old in India. That is 1/4 of the world's population under 25 years old. But Indian higher education is not set up for digital delivery at this time, at this point in time. They need our support, they need our help. And they need it in ways that are culturally responsive and culturally appropriate to their needs and their context, not just ours. And so we've got a lot of work to do in this creative solution space as we think about the challenges and opportunities. I wanted, Margaret, just to leave folks with a few questions. Dawn, my last slide. We all work in idiosyncratic contexts. So these are questions that worry me. And I welcome them worrying you, and I welcome you being a reason for you to reach out across your ecosystems, across your campuses, and into your local communities. Why do we do what we do in the DE&I space for international students? And is the work we're doing good enough? Where have we got strength, and where do we need to improve? Do we even know what good DEI goals are in the global context? Dawn's done a wonderful quick primer on global learning, but what does that mean for marginalized US populations? Populations that historically have never really thought about opportunities to travel abroad. Can we bring COIL and EDGE and global learning and content into their curriculum, into their experience? We must, I would argue, we must. And then we need to think about marginalization around the world. At Penn State, we're proud of the fact that we have rescued a number of Ukrainian and Afghan students and scholars in the last year to 2 years. But we're aware we didn't do that for the Rohingya. We worry about the Romani of Eastern Europe. We worry about the Syrian refugees, 7 million of whom are still displaced in Europe at this time. And we wonder what our role is. So I'll leave you those hard and critical questions. I hope, Margaret, that it was helpful to those listening to hear that wonderful sort of theoretical and research-based foundation from Dawn with a little bit of the applied thinking from my perspective. And over to you.
Very good. Thank you. You ready for questions?
Dawn is.
Oh, okay. Well, one of the first questions I have for you that have been raised is if you could give examples of how colleges and universities globalize their curriculum both in the US and in other countries as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think there are many, many models and ways that institutions have globalized their curriculum. I think one of the easiest and one of the things that many institutions do first is having a course on history in the world. A course where you're looking at intentionally infusing global perspectives. Another is adding. Some have called this in the internationalizing the curriculum literature, the additive model. It's also the same in the multicultural education literature, where you start adding authors, researchers, scholars into your course, where you add those dimensions where students are no longer just reading from a particular canon, but you're expanding and saying, okay, now we're going to make sure we have authors, scholars from every corner of the world. We've seen this done really well in language studies, where some have had students, you need to incorporate, if you're studying Spanish authors, right wing, left wing from articles and newspapers, that kind of thing. And then I would share one other example from international institutions. One thing they've done particularly well is also looking at global issues from international perspectives. So I'm just back from the American University in Cairo, and they were looking at human rights issues in one particular class. And so what they did is they looked in the Middle East, then they looked in Western Europe, then they looked in Eastern Europe, then they looked in the US, and then they were looking at some comparisons and what the political situation has to do with it. And I've seen many others do that as well. So the last thing I'll say and turn it over to Roger, the best thing and the thing that institutions that have been able to do this in an integrative way is when they have a learning outcome that pushes or that integrates global perspectives, and then all disciplines and departments can see themselves.
Wonderful, thanks, Dawn. I'll just add 3 quick thoughts, Margaret. The first is when I travel around the world, I'm surprised, I guess I'm surprised, I shouldn't be, but I am, how many institutions around the world are now aligning their curricular thinking around the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. It really has become a focus for many, many institutions. I've just come back from Asia and was struck by this in Asia as an example, one model. Think about it. I want to also suggest to you that it needs to be pervasive and authentic. And what that means to me, Dawn, you're right, it does start with a course, but it can't end with a course. If students just get to tick the box, to check the box, yep, that's my global in Gen Ed, done here, then we've failed. We need to find scope and sequence in curriculum. And global concepts need to permeate vertically as well as horizontally in time in the scope and sequence of the undergraduate experience and the graduate experience. And my last comment is, faculty often say to me, well, don't ask me to do one more thing. I can't do one more thing. I am not asking you to add a 46th, 47th, 48th hour to your 45 contact hours of a 3-hour course. I'm not asking you that. I'm asking you to think of authentic and organic activity and content that is global in nature, that is a part of your course objectives, that you can put in as a routine part of your 45 hours.
And do the STEM disciplines also internationalize their curriculum, diversify that also?
Absolutely. And I think, Roger, you didn't show this stat, and I think it just changed this year. But when you look at the Open Doors data, for years, the STEM disciplines were the top sending discipline for international experiences for education abroad. And what we learned from the engineering school at my previous campus and campuses that I've worked with is that when ABET had a requirement that focused on international perspectives and international engagement, especially when you're working at a team to solve a social issue, that pushed some of our STEM colleagues to do this work more intentionally. But there's always room for more, and it always depends on the institutional context.
Very good, thank you. A second question is, how can we combat new and proposed laws prohibiting DEI efforts in schools and in the workplace? Ideas?
Roger, you want to go first this time?
No, not at all, Dawn.
Okay, I'll just say one thing. I think when we're able to connect the benefits and the skills of global learning to workforce development, to skills that are necessary for civic engagement and community engagement, that helps make the case. And at some institutions, they have decided we might call this something different. I'm not saying that's the solution, but when you look at what the students are actually learning, and when employers are telling us they want students who can work in teams across differences, when employers are telling us they want employees who come in with an ability to communicate effectively in diverse groups, then we have to listen and look at what are the activities that students need to do to practice these skills. So I think it's helpful to go to the specific skills that are necessary, and many of those are connected to DEI and to global learning. So that's what I would recommend, is looking at what we're actually doing and not get caught up in language that may have been the language that may or may not actually define what's going on.
I have a couple of thoughts on this question, Margaret, and I'm not sure if it's where the questioner was going, but we've co-opted DE&I in political ways in this country, and a couple of observations that may be helpful to our attendees today. I like to think of DE&I in a global context by adding A and B, access and belonging. Access is a notion that crosses over issues of diversity and crosses over equity and inclusion. And belonging is a key construct. I think everybody at some visceral level has a personal understanding what belonging means. And at the end of the day, as human beings, we want to belong. We want to be a part of. We're social in our fabric. And so it might be helpful to that question to think about belonging as a key part of this work. And I want to make that observation. I also think sometimes you can look at yourself through the lens of others. And sometimes when you walk in the shoes of others, you have a different perspective and on your own life. And in that regard, global DE&I allows us into space, and it allows us to think about some of our own experiences through the experiences of others. So political science students would be thrilled to look at how the French nationals are currently looking at issues of retirement age, or how the British managed to burn through multiple prime ministers post-Brexit. Other students interested in sustainability might want to look at cities like Cape Town and Chennai and consider water shortage. Other students might want to look at issues of weather-related climate change. Sometimes you can be accused of all kinds of things if you talk about tornadoes and wildfires in the United States, but you can surely talk about those on a global scale and then bring it back to the United States. So it might be that having global conversations around content and concepts that are at the core of your teaching allow your students to reflect on the fact that A, we are all one world, and B, that there's something there for me to reflect upon in my own experience.
And Roger, I would just add, I think we had a nice question that just came in, and I think this connects to that question, is it also helps us when we remove ourselves from the US lens of DEI and we look at how DEI is constructed and framed in other countries. And that is one, it's instructive in terms of what's going on from the world, and that our framework isn't the same framework that's being used in most other places. It's dependent on our history. It's dependent on the context, the US context. And that also can help us think about how we should frame these types of experiences. You know, I think for one example, I was recently in a conversation and there was someone from Ireland, someone from France, and then someone from Ghana. And we were talking about, what does DEI even mean? What does it mean? One of the colleagues said, well, you know, in France, we can't collect racial data. So that's not an issue. You're talking about disaggregating data and figuring out who's participating. We don't do that. You know, another colleague said, well, in Ireland, when we first started doing this, we associated this more with gender issues and women being involved. A colleague in Ghana talked about it being something about individuals who were coming from the North, which was lesser developed. And so I think having these global conversations and looking at what DEI looks like in other contexts can help inform the way that we approach our work here, and it helps broaden the conversation for us.
Yeah, the point in the chat spoke to decolonization.
Mhm.
And just to emphasize your point, I think when we interact with our partners around the world, the first thing we have to do is listen.
Mhm.
You know, let's take some time to listen, and not to presume or to judge. We would be following in some unfortunate footsteps if we do.
And Roger, one other thing I would add to that as well, in thinking about decolonization, this is another opportunity for those who are in the global space or the international space, whichever framing your institution uses, is to collaborate with our colleagues that are doing good, ethical, community engaged learning, because many of them have had to decolonize their practices in the US to engage ethically with local communities, and many are doing that in an international context where they are looking at how can we have a truly reciprocal relationship? Can we have a relationship where we are coming into this as equals? And I think there's some research that's recently come out about collaborative online international learning, or COIL, as a third space, if you will, where countries and individuals that are coming across, your institution, my institution, in this digital space, there is a sense of equality that isn't often there when we are traveling or when we're going or we're bringing resources or doing something like that. So I think that's another way to decolonize, is finding these frameworks and places where we truly see each other as equals, and provide language, provide guidance, and actually listen to each other and make sure that neither side is dominating. So I think that's another way to think about decolonizing these experiences.
Good, thank you very much. Shall I go to another one? Okay. This is a question that says, on a university campus with a focus on domestic multicultural diversity, how do you persuade colleagues working in student affairs and academic affairs of the importance to incorporate DEI in a global context? What are some concrete examples of how that can be presented?
I'll kick off if you like.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important that the communication across your campus colleagues is clear and consistent and ongoing. We're talking, I mean, that might sound a little trite, Margaret, but in higher education, we are masters of silos. And I think part of my work in the global/international office is to be that horizontal bridge and to pull those groups together. I think it's particularly important in the student affairs space. So I talk monthly to my head of housing at the university.
I see.
Just to check in, just to make sure. We have a wonderful office at this institution that oversees student rights and responsibilities, but also is at the core of our efforts around emergency funding for international students, as well as domestic students. So I would encourage us to think about who are the key colleagues that we work with on our campus or need to work with to be effective for international students. And then how do we engage them, and how do we bring them to this table? I have various advisories that help me with this work. And I have a leadership team who are committed to being external, being out, being around campus, and being seen as a resource and a benefit for our whole campus. It can't just be about inbound and outbound mobility and a few partnerships. It has to be about how we are a core part of the university vision and mission, and to promote and assist and help our faculty and our staff around the university. And that's the spirit we bring to this. And when they have needs, they call, because they realize that we're actually a resource for them and we're advocates for what they're trying to do. And Spent 45 minutes on a call earlier this afternoon with a colleague across campus who needed some assistance related to an international issue. And that has to be what we're going for. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think that moves us towards something that I think of as more authentic and organic on our college campus.
Yeah, Roger, I would just add, I think, you know, a couple of examples based on the type of partnering that you described on campuses. We've seen institutions where they intentionally partnered, the international office intentionally partnered with the DEI office. So the SIO, the senior international officer, and the chief diversity officer started meeting and doing things. And then they found that they were advocates for each other in spaces that their colleague wasn't. So a similar situation, a campus in the Midwest, when there were discussions about closing housing at the height of COVID. And one of the, you know, the chief diversity officer said, wait a minute, if we close housing, what's going to happen to our international students? And no one would have thought that the chief diversity officer would have been advocating for the international students, but because of the relationship, the type that you described, they were aware of each other's issues and they were ready to be allies and advocates for each other. I think one other example is, and again, this comes from some great research from Chris Glass, is looking at what are opportunities for intentional engagement for student groups across domestic diversity or international diversity. Are we finding ways in first-year seminars? Do we have a first-year seminar perhaps that has a high concentration of international students? Are we finding ways to make connections for those students with others? Are we having student orgs that say we're going to have an activity and we're going to invite the African Student Association to come? Individuals might not come, but a group may come. And I think lastly, I would say, again, as Roger talked about earlier, organizing and looking at things around global issues. And some of the research that Christina Yao has done out of the University of South Carolina is looking at these broad issues that are impacting all of our students, particularly students of color, both domestic and international, and finding ways to address those issues and bring in students across the board to engage. I think those are some other ways that we've seen success across the country in particular.
Yeah, I hesitate to keep giving examples because it makes it sound like I have the answers, and together with all the wonderful staff in Penn State Global, we struggle with this and stay on this all the time. But one example is our global engagement leadership experience, where we purposefully bring groups of international students and domestic students together to work over a weekend with each other. That's the kind of thing that could be done whether our colleagues listening in on this call are at a wonderful small liberal arts doing amazing work, or at a big R1 doing amazing work. At the end of the day, those are the sorts of intentional efforts that we can make with our colleagues in student affairs. The one area that I do think we need to help our student affairs colleagues with more, well, there are any number, but one of them is, I always worry that sometimes our international students come from cultural backgrounds where it's viewed as a limitation or a weakness to seek counsel and support and care. And we have to keep working on making sure that our international students know the resources that are available to them on campus, because sometimes they're hesitant to really jump into that space. And it's critical to the success that we encourage them to do so.
Well, Roger, there's one of the questions that you actually sort of touched upon in that last remark. This question says, it isn't enough to simply gather diverse people in a room. How do we concretely build more intentionality to gathering diverse groups of people in order to really encourage growth and perspective from all of those students involved?
Yeah, this is a labor of love, colleagues. Let's start with gather diverse people in the room. Well, if your institution's like mine, something less than 10% of all your faculty are African American or Black Americans. So are we going to get our tokens in the room? Right, so let's start there, right? What does diversity mean in the context of our university, and what are we seeking from our colleagues in the way of their expertise, their service, their wisdom, their guidance, their advice? And let's not just sort of say, yeah, we got one of these, we got one of those, we got one of the other, and we got one of them. We must be diverse. That hopefully we've learned that lesson. Diversity might mean that I have a couple of Indian students in a South Asia group, one of whom comes from the Punjab and whose parents speak Pashtun, and another who comes from Chennai, literally 500-600 miles away, and whose parents speak Tamil. So we can't just sort of jump to, oh, here's our Indian student, here's our Brazilian student. We need a female Malay student. We have to be more thoughtful than that. And the way I approach this work is to try and make sure that I get multiple perspectives in the space. And I certainly encourage our student groups to do that, to pick student leaders who represent the whole of the student association and take their concerns and build experiences for the student group that will benefit everybody. It's an ongoing effort. Ecosystem, I think the key is to identify who are your champions in this space. So I've talked a little about students. I have champions in institutional research, go figure. Wonderful champions for our work and who help us think about this effort. I have champions in faculty affairs, in educational equity. And these folks understand that their work is for all the students and all the faculty of the university. I happen to work at the university with over 350 foreign national faculty. And we need to take care of our foreign national faculty as well as our foreign national students, while simultaneously engaging our domestic students in those difficult questions. It's not inappropriate or somehow woke to ask students to go on a journey where they reflect on their own cultural characteristics. That is not something that should be co-opted for political means. That's about helping 18-year-olds become 22-year-olds.
And Roger, I would add one thing, particularly when it comes to student learning, and working in diverse groups is a learning outcome that many people have in their course experience. And so that experience, and again, we have so many different types of colleges and universities. There are colleges and universities where the student population is very diverse, but the students haven't been asked to do anything or to think about how they're coming together and working across difference. So to me, the key is transparency in telling students what it is we want you to do. Why do we want you to do this? When you're working in a community, okay, what do you see as the diversity in this group? There are people with different educational levels, people from different parts of the country. I think, as Roger touched on this with the model of students from different parts of India, but even people within the US. At our institution, we have people from the East, from the West, from the North, from the South, a particular side of the city, and being clearly articulating to students that we want to give you this experience to work across diversity and across difference, and wrestle with how you feel about it. What would you have done differently? What should you have done differently? And giving them an opportunity to critically reflect on the situation and how it connects to that course, how it connects to their disciplines, how it connects to their future work and future membership in society. And so I think we see a lot of institutions that are embedding some of these working across difference into assignments, activities, and that helps students articulate clearly the value.
And I think for many of us, just giving our students an experiential learning opportunity where they are working in their local communities will be a powerful experience for all of them. And maybe it just begins there, recognizing what's outside our college gates.
Yes, we've reached the end of our time, but I do want to say that one of the questions goes to exactly that point, Roger, about the importance of seeking extracurricular opportunities, such as volunteering and outreach and internships for our students to better develop DEI learning.
And become more empathic.
That's right. Okay. We have come to the end of the time. I want to thank both of you so much for giving us this perspective, because I believe the relationship of DEI and globalization is one that really needs to be developed even more. So thank you very much for giving us your knowledge on this subject. Thank you and goodbye. Goodbye. And thank you again.